Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste, this is lecture 3 in which we try to understand what was the contribution of some of the forerunners of social sciences and how did they engage with some of the philosophical issues which emerged in the Enlightenment, and how it eventually leads us to understand a very typical, a very particular kind of response coming from social scientists, and that response was called positivism. So, as we have seen in the previous lecture, Newtonian way of seeing sealed off the philosophical debate on the nature and scope of scientific way of seeing. Hence, this is not surprising that methodologically Newton became the new god for many who took to look at social world. But then the discursive spirit, frames of references and value orientation that interrupted the scientific ways of looking at social reality was fraught with the synthesis of various kinds. Most prominent of such synthesis emerged from the encyclopedists, the philosophers who were upholding the clarion call of the Enlightenment. This synthesis of various kinds, including that of Immanuel Kant, with which we got familiar in the last lecture, that engaged and departed from the Cartesian, Baconian and Lockean ideas while taking note of the supremacy of Newtonian accomplishment. Thus, the background was fairly complex, to which many of the predecessors, including Montesquieu and Rousseau, Bonald and Mestre, as bearers of conservative and romantic interventions, and Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte at visionaries of sociology, had to refer to. The combination of Montesquieu and Rousseau and Bonald and Mestre is suggestive of the complicated character of modernity, because we know that with Enlightenment project there also emerges this overarching category of modernity with its philosophical wisdom and value orientation in place. It is this complication that enriches sociology's relation with science, modernity and the Enlightenment philosophy. It was with the conservative wing, as someone like Gunnar Myrdal pointed out, it was with the conservative wing that realism in a way of seeing the social world dawned upon. A turn to realism begins as such with the body of conservative thoughts, and also to some extent romantic thoughts. Given this importance, it is not surprising that someone, a sociologist like Emile Durkheim, acknowledged Montesquieu and Rousseau as sociology's precursors. Both were keen to unravel the finer components responsible for the maintenance of order in society, and their philosophy is thus directly responding to some of the crucial social concerns. The systematic way of unearthing, classifying and interpreting the types seen in society in order to understand what is rather than what ought to be, that is central. This whole thing is central in Montesquieu's spirit of the laws. Each of the societal types possess unique principle in Montesquieu's framework. These unique principles are also inner force of each societal type, according to which each type functions. If the principle for the societal type, for example, despotism, is fear, for monarchy it is honor, and for democracy it is virtue. Laws are in accordance with the principle of the type that it seeks to govern. This is some basic ideas emerging from Montesquieu, who was hailed as ambivalent Cartesian, and as an ambivalent Cartesian, Montesquieu exhibits explicit commitment to the Cartesian rationalism without accepting the conclusive ideas thereof. Hence, while on one hand Montesquieu would meditate upon various issues in a fairly Cartesian manner of doubting to arrive at indubitable, he would also be keen to gather his impressions of the world without rejecting them as external distractions, as was done in Cartesian philosophy. While he would maintain a rational outlook in his propositions, he would believe in the possibility of a rational science of human world that can discuss the concrete social world without a concrete social world rather than abstract notions of philosophers. So, it is not out of place that Montesquieu upheld Cartesian methods without applying them in his own observations. The way of seeing that enables Montesquieu to present a prognostic explanation of society through its types is akin to that of a physician. And someone like Isaac Berlin has noted about Montesquieu, and I quote, "A physician does not, after all, usually ask himself what precisely it is that good health consists in and why. He takes it for granted and calls himself a physician because he knows a healthy and normal organism from one which is sick and abnormal, and knows moreover that what is good for one type of organism may be fatal to another, and that what is needed in one climate is unnecessary or dangerous in another." Similarly, Montesquieu assumed that the idea of political and moral health is too familiar to need any analysis, and that when it is present, this is quite patent, and that to be rational is to recognize it for what it is, to know the symptoms, to know how to cure the relevant diseases, and how to maintain the organism. Montesquieu's quest of types is aimed at the principles underlying the types rather than only morphological discovery of the empirical forms. And through the details of these socio-political types, Montesquieu predisposes social sciences toward interrelated institutions. In other words, one ought to be seeing through the social institutions and thereof interconnections, the patterns of interactions, and most importantly, the general principles that govern the social and political. Moreover, Montesquieu hints at the importance of adopting the perspective of other, the views of the outsiders of an institution, rather than only dwelling upon the experiences of the insiders. The idea of comparative perspective thereby takes a methodological form. With such orientation, Montesquieu contributed a discussion on spirit as a force derived from general principles of institutions, relations, and interactions. While doing so, his works anticipated the idea of division of labor, its role in determining the characteristics of social relations, and the concomitant idea of social solidarity. All of these were reverberant, very important in theoretical functionalism in social sciences, and more precisely in the sociology of a milder kind. The theoretical contribution of Montesquieu is of immense value, as it aids in understanding the ways in which society can uphold itself in the wake of explicit utilitarianism interfering human relations. Montesquieu maintained faith in science and optimism about the role of modernity, while he also kept a fairly skeptical stance that was irritant to the encyclopedists, the philosophical counterparts, some of his contemporaries. This was skepticism about the high hopes of human perfection, transition from traditional to rational, and he had a suspicion about Enlightenment ideals. There was a sense of natural conservatism in Montesquieu's outlook that distinguished his way of seeing from that of his contemporaries, many other philosophers. And the best way to comprehend this as a crucial component in Montesquieu's way of seeing is to hear from him the way he speaks of something as impersonal as laws. And I quote Montesquieu here: "Laws, in the most general signification, are the necessary relations arising from the nature of things. In this sense, all beings have their laws. The deity has his laws, the material world its own laws, the intelligence superior to man, they have their own laws, the beasts their own laws, and man his laws." Quote ends. Guided by facts rather than abstract principles attained as a priori from the realms of philosophical reasoning, Montesquieu does not reject the significance of religions, traditions, and social institutions as they are. Moreover, he maintains a semblance of relativism, not difficult to say that it is relativism, a semblance of relativism about the cause and effects, without subscribing to his compatriots, the encyclopedists, the philosophers, for whom a clear logical causal explanation is an end result in scientific inquiry. Unlike them, Montesquieu does not subscribe to this kind of simplistic scientific scheme. Steering clear of any such prior epistemological determinations coming from the bodies of philosophy, Montesquieu is like a curious child, as it were, seeking to see the probable causes of equally probable consequences. This is most explicit as he ruminates on the transition from the laws of nature to positive laws. And I quote him again: "Man in a state of nature would have the faculty of knowing before he had acquired any knowledge. Plain it is that his first ideas would not be of speculative nature. He would think of the preservation of his being before he would investigate its origin. Such a man would feel nothing in himself at first but impotency and weakness. His fears and apprehensions would be excessive, as appears from the instances. Were there any necessity of proving it? As it appears from the instances, and he asks, were there any necessity of proving it? So, from the instances of savages, it appears savages who were found in forests. As soon as man enters into a state of society, he loses the sense of his weakness. Equality ceases, and then commences the state of war. Each particular society begins to feel its strength, whence arises a state of war between different nations. The individuals, likewise, of each society become sensible of their force, and hence the principal advantages of this society they endeavor to convert to their own emolument, which constitutes a state of war between individuals." Quote ends. Having understood this, it is not surprising that Durkheim is quoted to have written, and I quote Durkheim now. Durkheim says, having been familiar with Montesquieu and his work, Durkheim says, "It is Montesquieu who first laid down the fundamental principles of social science. Not that he stated them in explicit terms, he speculated very little about the conditions of the science he inaugurated. But he speculated less about the conditions. But these principles are the principles that he delivers. These principles are conditions inherent in his ideas, and it is not difficult to recognize and formulate them. Quote ends. This acknowledgement by Durkheim is very significant. It puts Montesquieu in that important space from where Montesquieu is truly, and his body of thought is truly, a forerunner's contribution to modern social science. Like Montesquieu, as noted earlier, Rousseau's contribution was geared to build upon the idea of order in social world where individuals are free with choices and will. Walking the bridge between the Enlightenment rationalism and Romantic utopianism, he sought to show the possibility of perfection in humans, underlining that the social men and natural men are reconciled for a better society. And toward this, Rousseau announces the restoration of relation between the sciences and the arts, which could contribute to the purification rather than the alleged corruption of morality wrought by a misleading science and distorted arts. So, as it seems, he departs from the rationalist short-sightedness of some sort, and we would begin to see that natural men are not as savage as we might think, and social men are not as utilitarian as the socio-political and economic perspectives would show us. Thus, Rousseau rejects the Hobbesian idea of the natural state as a state of war, as a war of each against all. The naturalist romanticism becomes a way of seeing in Rousseau's negotiation as well as departure from the plain rationalism of the Enlightenment, enabling him to see more than what was shown and seen in the epoch dominated by scientific empiricism. His way of seeing thus encapsulates sentimentalism and intellectualism, truth and lies, facts and fables, as he emphasizes mythology, ordinary citizens, and a practice-oriented outlook. This all is well elucidated in the 2 volumes of Discourses that shows that Rousseau sees things differently. And a classic announcement of this is in the Discourse on Science and Art, where Rousseau says, and I quote, "If our sciences are vain in the objects they set for themselves, they are even more dangerous in the effects they produce." Quote ends. However, while doing so, Rousseau maintains his commitment to truth with the device which is phrased as vitam impendre vero, translated by the Dictionary of Latin into to risk one's life for truth. He has commitment to this kind of philosophical axiom vitam impendre vero, meaning to risk one's life for truth. With this commitment, he tends to depart from the plain and simple scientific epistemology of the Enlightenment. However, his location is within the frame of Enlightenment. The paradoxical epistemological position that he shows through the discussions interspersed in various works of Rousseau, including his work titled Emily, that paradoxical epistemological position is very, very important for the rest of the social sciences which will emerge just subsequently after the contributions of the forerunners. The evil then Rousseau sees is not a natural state of being. Instead, man becomes a warrior only after he becomes a citizen. Despite this, Rousseau is more hopeful with the citizens than with the philosophers. Citizens' practical knowledge imbued with natural perceptions is better source of understanding them and their world. And it is the citizens' ignorance of the abstract rationalism that Rousseau employs as a stance against the Enlightenment. He defends this ignorance, he defends citizens' ignorance, and in this way, the only way to bring about a semblance of order is through a realization, and the realization is like this: you need me, for I am rich and you are poor. Let's therefore make a contract with one another. I will do you honor to permit you to serve me under the condition that you give me what little you still have left for the trouble I shall take in commanding you. Quote ends. This is a quote from Rousseau, and thus it enters the discussion on the renowned social contract that is credited to Rousseau. In arriving at this proposition, there is a clear methodological orientation. It pertains to objective evaluation of the prejudices that occupies the social world as well as its interpreters. There is no denial of the presence of prejudices. However, there is, instead of dismissing them, Rousseau's methodological preparation is to evaluate them. For example, Rousseau would critically evaluate Hobbes' thesis as well as the social and natural world. In doing so, the methodological orientation of Rousseau dwells upon some of the axiomatic ideas, his self-evaluated prejudice that natural is corrupted by social, and this is in tandem with, on one hand, Locke's empiricism, that knowledge is by and large a posteriori proposition. One experiences and thus one knows and acts in the social world. So, this is on one hand what occupies Rousseau's methodological orientation, this kind of empiricism. But then on the other hand, Rousseau's axiom underpins another implication, and that is about the state of nature. The natural state also entails knowledge, propositions and actions. This could be available for our understanding empirically too, but this state is capable of nurturing ability of intuition, meditation and more liberating kind of existence for both people and seeker of knowledge. In nutshell, Rousseau's methodological proposition, if one derives from it, his methodological proposition can be dubbed as an evaluative empiricism. Perhaps this serves well for making sense of the human world, which is rife with intersections of natural and social. Rousseau does not present a replica of scientific empiricism, which could pretend value neutrality, so to say. His departure from the Enlightenment notions of knowing is on the basis of what he learns from Socrates. Curiously enough, it is not Platonic Socrates, for Rousseau refashions some of the Socratic ideals and attempts to develop a unique way of seeing. Rousseau's Socrates, as it were, persuades us to start with the Socratic idea, and the idea being, know that we do not know. Know that we do not know. According to Rousseau, it is better to be ignorant than be complacent with pseudo knowledge. The tyrannical authority of science has undermined the domain from where virtues, morals and sanity in the state of freedom could emerge. So, we understand very briefly how Rousseau is trying to controvert the scientific epistemology, and he is trying to add to scientific epistemology with a very refreshingly different kind of position. Continuing in this line, the categories of community, family, society and also nation was beginning to appear as the important locus of human engagements in the conservative thinking in the late 18th century, particularly after the French Revolution. It begins to appear particularly after the French Revolution. Conservatism, the word conservative has acquired negative connotation unfortunately, but conservatism upheld a particular methodological style, a body of philosophical ideas which helps social scientists in approaching the concrete social institutions and minds behind those institutions. The uniqueness of this methodology arising from the conservative body of philosophy was recognized even by Karl Mannheim. In the conservative methodology, as Mannheim also noted, the Cartesian determination of rationality or the empiricism of the age of reason are combated with empirical observation of everything that are seen in the social world. It allows historicism to replace the deductive procedure of the 18th century philosophers. It's very paradoxical that the stress on historicism begins to appear from the philosophical advocacies made by conservative philosophers. The conservatives thus see a real man, unlike their predecessors who saw abstract man imagined in the larger philosophical framework of the Enlightenment. The conservatives' man, in other words, is not a philosopher's envisioned ideal man. It is the way man is, natural and social at once, and potentially more than what philosophers get to see, such as Frenchman or Englishman, peasant or aristocrat, churchman, businessman, soldier or statesman. These historical entities have equally tangible institutions and customs. By putting the real, concrete, historical in the center of analysis, one can suggest that the conservative thought brought about a sociological turn in philosophical ruminations. Moreover, the conservatives delivered a conceptual turf inclined to the typology of traditionalist and modernist. This was in the conservative scheme of contrasting the ancient regime with medieval roots and the twin forces of revolutionary democracy with the industrial movement. All these things begin to happen within the framework of conservative philosophy. It is in this regard, it is imperative to recall Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. This was a work that not only presented a lucid critique of otherwise so celebrated revolution in the history of modern politics, but also it laid out the contours of more socially sensitive propositions, observations, studies to be done, understanding to be developed. Giving due space to community, Burke in his analysis showed that individual can have abstract rights, and if there is a community, there will be a past encapsulating tradition, customs and institutions of the predecessors. There would be continuity in present, some sort of continuity. No revolution has the moral right to destroy it in order to deliver abstract notions. For Burke, reason is not an entity that ought to be thought of as a means to end or an abstract tool in the hand of a few enlightened philosophers. Instead, reason exists in the realm of reality. This is very powerful proposition. Reason as it is in the realm of reality. For rational and real are intertwined, and hence reason has to be located in the realm of reality. In this line of thinking, another philosopher, Hegel, arrived at the notion of cosmic force, the idea, the spirit, the absolute, or even God. It is through these notions that the relation of natural and social comes to the fore for philosophical recognition in the Hegelian scheme. I am not going into the detail of a very vast body of work which these philosophers have presented. Intention is not to it's not promised that there would be an exhaustive perusal of their work, briefly touching upon the implications that emerge from some of these bodies of philosophical ideas. The conservatism, unlike the pejorative connotation with which this word appears in contemporary discourse, it offered a perspective on medieval order. Louis de Bonald and Joseph de Maistre revived the usages such as divine providence, original sin, final causes, and infallible church acquired center stage in this scheme of reasoning. Bonald's scheme of reasoning sought to diminish the role of individual in the creation of works of art and literature by showing them as socio-cultural artifacts. And by doing so, he was actually addressing Montesquieu and Rousseau, who had put aside the socio-moral conditioning and the role of the collective in the creation of knowledge. Maistre attacked Rousseau for the dichotomized understanding of men as social and natural, as though there was nothing in common between the two. And likewise, Bonald rejected the idea of natural man, natural right, in order to emphasize that all men are social and so are men's rights. Likewise, Maistre gives premium to the family as a prototype of society, with an argument that the sexual differentiation pertained to the divine, the social differentiation pertained to the divine purpose behind the order on the earth. The lawgiver like Moses, and unlike Rousseau or anyone else from the ilk of the Enlightenment, those lawgivers are more important in underlining the moral underpinnings of the physical social unity. Evidently, Bonald sharpens the way of seeing for social science that would emphasize the scheme of social in the making of men and their institutions. In the same breath, Bonald deems idea to be innate in men. Though this does not align with the Cartesian philosophy, for the innate ideas are socially communicated, both Bonald and Maistre departed from Edmund Burke too, in casting aspersions on the ideas of reformation. Particularly Maistre, who was keen to show function of institutions, he held the Reformation for evil repercussions in society. They both singled out Protestantism, capitalism and science as the key movers of disturbances in social order. And one begins to see that the category of social order becomes central in this analysis. On the whole, the conservative thoughts had shifted attention from free individual to group, from social change to stability, from abstract idealization of man to concrete man attached to the idea of social order. It had added a new perspective for reasoning in social contexts. This is the background laid out by forerunners engaging with their compatriots and philosophers who were part of this massive churning named the Enlightenment. In this background, we get to see someone like Henry Saint-Simon and later followed by Auguste Comte. We get to see them engaging with some of the questions which would become crucial in social science, in modern disciplines of social science, and particularly in sociology, in addition to along with other disciplines. Henry Saint-Simon shared the conservative critique of revolutionary philosophical proposition and the French Revolution, even though he had himself participated in the American Revolution in past. What he did not seem to share with the conservative, however, was the uncritical submission to a particular kind of order that belonged to medieval history. There was this discomfort about the glorification of this order which was witnessed in medieval history or ancient regime. Moreover, his take on socialism, Saint-Simon's take on socialism, though more of utopian nature, was expressive of his interest in dealing with the anomalies of the new world order, and this is very crucial to remember. With Saint-Simon, we start taking turn to the anomalies as they are encountered in the new world order, those concrete anomalies, the concrete setup in which those anomalies are located. And this new world order that was being enforced by capitalism. So, taking note of those anomalies in the new world order enforced by capitalism, this itself becomes a mark of distinction. So, what is Saint-Simon doing? He is envisaging the possibility of reconstruction. By taking note of anomalies, there is this urge toward reconstruction, and in this reconstruction, if the notion of order was important, so was the role of science, order and science. He envisaged that the new elite with scientific spirit and international orientation in industrial society would replace the educated elite of the Middle Ages. He envisaged that science would be a new religion, carried forward by the new intellectual class, well versed in scientific temperament, scientific philosophical debates, well versed in scientific epistemology. This class was going to be more important in Saint-Simonian understanding of the industrial society. The international order in the Middle Ages was possible due to the church, and church itself was an international organization, and that international organization maintained, firmed up the international order in the Middle Ages. One cannot go back to the Middle Ages. In a very realistic way, Saint-Simon reminds us. However, one can explore the similar alternative philosophy binding the nations across the world. This was at the core of Saint-Simon's promulgation on positivism that tried to synthesize the learning from 17th and 18th century along with that of 19th century. Saint-Simonian positivism is about creating a world where nations from across globe would come together because they would share the ethos of science, and they would try to address some of the anomalies together. This is akin to Newtonian physics. Positivism, in the light of Newtonian physics, was to aid in the science of human social world. Only positivism can engender a set of common truths that would bind humans in the relation of mutual trust and respect. It is evident that Saint-Simon tries to refashion science, which works toward human world with a strong sense of positive thinking. Unlike the scientific epistemology developed by philosophers, unlike the negative understanding that they have of humans as fallible creatures, Saint-Simonian positivism is about giving premium to the ability of humans in this new world, invoking that enabled humans in this new world. He imagines even politics to be informed by science, not only humans, not only social world order, not only human world will have positive thinking, even politics will have positive thinking, it will be informed by science, and thereby political questions would be scientific questions. No wonder that Durkheim credited Saint-Simon for origin and evolution of positivism, as he observed Saint-Simon as the first to conceive that between the formal generalities of metaphysical philosophy and the narrow specialization of the particular sciences, there was a place for a new enterprise, whose pattern he supplies and he himself attempted. Therefore, it is to him that one must, in full justice, award the honor currently given to Comte. These are the words of Emile Durkheim. Even the stages of intellectual growth and emergence of positive philosophy that Comte claimed to be his contribution were actually elucidated by Saint-Simon. Instead of getting into any kind of controversy as to who should be considered more founding a figure, we just get a cursory glance through what they had to offer and try to understand how they are responding to the newly emergent scientific epistemology, the most legitimate kind of knowledge, system of knowledge. How are they responding to? So, like Saint-Simon, Comte stressed on the negative intentions and implications of the Enlightenment and the Revolution. The Enlightenment philosophers were, as per Comte, metaphysicians who broke away from old order of theological stage and paved the way for something more positive. His formulation entails three stages: theological, metaphysical and positive, which apparently Comte verified through experience. In a jocular way, Anthony Giddens, sociologist, notes that Comte claimed to have achieved personal verification of the law of three stages in his periods of insanity, which he had experienced, he claimed, as regression back though from positivism to metaphysics to theology on the level of his personality, in his recovery, retracing these stages forward again. In this wake, Comte also repudiated even Hegelian dialectic for inherent tendency to negate. As a remedy to the deplorable anarchy in socio-political order, the disturbance in socio-political order, Comte presented his social physics that would bring about a replacement for the old order that had outlived its utility. Every stage in the evolutionary scheme of Comte had its dogma. Departing from the theological stage, the progressive metaphysicians created another set of dogmas, and equality, sovereignty, liberty are some of the dogmas created by the metaphysicians, and he is referring to the Enlightenment philosophers as those metaphysicians. One can see through such dogmas if one is adequately scientific. One can unravel these dogmas if one is adequately scientific, and hence lay persons are not to be trusted in the positive philosophy. Positive philosophy therefore becomes a realm for only extraordinary intellectually capable persons. This is just as astronomers, physicists and chemists do not need interference of the non-experts in their respective scientific domain of inquiry. This is, however, with recognition that in the hierarchy of sciences, which is again typical of Comtean contribution, that in the hierarchy of sciences, the science of human world will be deemed youngest and at the lowest rung. The distinction of this particular branch of science toward which Comte is inclined begins to take an exclusive character in the finitude and conclusion of positive philosophy. It reveals the centrality of method, quality of truth, and the importance of trained expertise. The methods are clones of scientific methods, subordinating imagination to observation and reason to facts. And it is through such practices a seeker of knowledge about social world can fathom the relation of parts with the whole. Interestingly enough, the positive philosophy befriends public order by bringing back men's understanding to a normal state through the influence of its method alone, before it has had time to establish any social theory. It dissipates disorder by by imposing a series of indisputable scientific conditions on the study of political questions. By including social science in the scientific hierarchy, the positive spirit admits to success in this study only well prepared and disciplined minds, so trained in the preceding departments of knowledge as to be fit for the complex problems of the last. The long and difficult preliminary elaboration must be checked. These are the ways in which Comte would lay out the procedural details of positivism. While a version of positivism shows in the works of Saint Simon and Auguste Comte with more tangible and methodological manifestations in Durkheim's functionalist sociology, there is a little linkage that it had with the philosophical positivism of the Vienna Circle, a famously known circle of scholars coming from various disciplinary background, and it was called Vienna Circle. This circle comprised of mathematicians, physicists, philosophers and scientists and many others, and it began to function in early 20th century. Self-proclaimed progenitors of new enlightenment, this circle was, according to one of its recounters named Fail, it carried forward the spirit of David Hume and Auguste Comte with more developed logical tool. It sought to reconfigure empiricism, dismissing Kantian idea of a synthetic a priori, and it mostly stressed on hypothetic deductive logic. This version of positivism was extremely mathematical in its approach. It was very rigid about the methods and techniques, and it advocated an idea that social scientific studies of social reality must not be at any cost be affected by opinions, values, any kind of extra factual material. And that way the positivism, logical positivism of Vienna Circle is distinguishable from the positivism which are more prevalent in social sciences, where positivism was also about perpetuating certain kind of vision of reconstruction, advocating certain kind of vision of the world which would be brought together by the influence of, by the virtue of scientific ethos. With this brief understanding of positivism as a response to in continuity with the forerunners of social science, and as a response to the philosophical discussions given by the Enlightenment philosophy, we are almost prepared to take a look at some of the classical sociologists in order to understand how do they engage with the basic ideas emerging from the scientific epistemology. That we will be doing in the next lecture. Thank you. So, as it appears from this discussion on positivism and the forerunners of social sciences, that they are consciously engaging with some of the basic tenets which emerged from the Enlightenment philosophy. Some of the figures from Enlightenment philosophy are very important for them, and those figures have been discussed in the previous lecture. René Descartes, Cartesian body of philosophy, Cartesian fundamentals are always taken as reference point. The difficulty in resolving a debate on the question whether knowledge is entirely inscribed experience on a blank slate called human mind, or there is something before the inscription happens, and that those things, understanding, interpretation, knowledge which are before this inscription, prior to that inscription, are they also important in the scheme of scientific epistemology? Some of these questions are most revisited questions even amongst the forerunners. These questions are also haunting questions for those who are trying to lay out the basic contours of positivism. The basic contour of positivism, which was to redress the problem of negativity, which was envisioned, problem of negativity which was envisioned in the philosophical discourse of the Enlightenment philosophers. Positivism sought to redress that negativity. It sought to replace abstractions, philosophical abstractions of human world, individual, social world, nature, science, intellectual growth, development, the abstractions about all these things, abstract idea about contract, order, how to maintain order, the Hobbesian question, all those things which were in abstraction, within the frame of positivism, they try to, they are given concrete forms, they are given colors, flesh and bone arising from the real setup of society at large. By concretizing some of these issues, by concretizing some of those philosophical idealization, positivism is also actually invoking intellectual force of the world. Number one, to believe in the scientific ethos, in positive philosophy, and number two, to work toward it, which would probably help in the reconstruction of social world which has vulnerable scheme of order. The vulnerability of order can be addressed only by these new intellectuals, these new elites. This is what we have understood. Throughout this journey, from the beginning of scientific epistemology up to this point when we have positivistic responses emerging, throughout this journey, experience is an important category. Throughout this journey, at the tail end of this lecture, I would like to emphasize there is another thing very important, and which is emphasis on the idea that knowledge in the wake of science will be an extraordinary category. It will not be something very ordinary. It will not be something which can stay untouched which can be immune to investigation. If there is something immune to investigation, some kind of experience, that would not get place of pride, respectful amount of attention in the frame of scientific knowledge. Knowledge itself becomes an extraordinary entity, and one can understand that with some stretch of imagination, one can understand that this extraordinary knowledge would be source of power in time to come. Knowledge would become equivalent of power. Alongside, what it also does, this whole discussion in the last couple of lectures, what it also does is that it converts a seeker of knowledge into an extraordinary creature. For René Descartes, this extraordinary creature was supposed to have that I, which would be independent of the rest of the body system. That was the extraordinary I for Descartes. That extraordinariness of the knower, the seeker of knowledge, is maintained. That extraordinariness is also maintained in the framework of positivism. These are the new elites. Saint Simon imagines the new elites who would be believer in scientific ethos, who would be ready to engage with contexts across the globe, who would have some sense of connectedness among themselves. In other words, who would not fall prey to ethnocentrism, who would not be bound by the context, who would not be allured by the idea of context sensitive knowledge, who would be willing to offer universal, generalizable principles. This extraordinary creature called intellectual also comes into being in this whole trajectory. One begins to understand that anything which is even slightly removed from this extraordinary would not be considered, would be a derivative of some kind, at worst would be something extremely spurious, from which any of those extraordinary minds, extraordinary I, extraordinary positivist social scientists, all of them should be detached from these spurious materials, should be able to say that, you know what, I am entirely untouched by any of those things, should be able to say that when I am doing social science, I am not dealing with any of those materials which are doubtful within social science, which are not from a particular pedigree. If it is from a particular epistemological pedigree, it would be a source of information for me, or it would be a matter of interest for me. This is also one of the implications emerging from this whole trajectory, and this I wanted to emphasize because it helps us in understanding the intellectual politics which this whole discourse implies. We will be returning to these issues in the lectures later on as well. For the time being, this is it. Thank you.